So, very warm welcome from our side to the first presentation of the day, and we'd like to give you a short, or an hour, or let's say 45 minutes, and then we write a test afterwards, right? About the history of Porsche. This year we're celebrating 75 years of Porsche sports cars, and we would like to give you a brief insight into this. 75 years of sports cars. The motto, the claim is driven by dreams, and we are concentrating on the people, and later on we are going to explain why is that. But before we do so, we'd like to introduce ourselves, and we might start with the guy next to me, Grant Larson, designer at Porsche. Please welcome him, and if you'd like to tell a little bit about your work, go ahead.
Thank you, Frank, or Frank. So thank you and welcome everybody. A couple of familiar faces here. So basically, like Frank said, this Driven by Dreams about the people. Just like the club, it's all about the people. And we thought it's always interesting for us to, it's always a focus on the cars. I did a few presentations here where it's like the development story of a certain car, and with a little bit of focus on the people. This time we're turning it around a little bit. And it kind of parallels the new book that we came out for 75 years of Porsche, where there's big focus on the people. So speaking of people, this is my little sort of portfolio from the past, in case, just to kind of explain who we are. You're next after me, what kind of stuff we did. I've been a designer at Porsche since 1989. So every year, if I stand up in here, give a presentation, it keeps counting more and more. Now it's 34 years, and as time goes on, you start collecting a lot of projects. So anyway, the Boxster, of course, you get this label on your head as a Boxster designer, but after that, there were a few more projects. So, and it's just not stopping, even I'm getting like really old. So these are some of the more recent projects, and one project that kind of stands out here is this guy, the classic club coupe that we did last year, finished last year and presented at Amelia Island and auctioned it off for 1.2 million. What day was that? What day is it today?
Wednesday. Yeah.
About 10 days ago or something like that in Atlanta. And it will be received by the new owner this afternoon. That's still sort of a little bit top secret kind of thing. Okay, moving forward.
Yeah,
your turn.
This is going to be about me. You see, I'm not that long at Porsche, but with Porsche anyhow, because from my my father took me from the hospital back to my home place when I was born in a 911 T Targa. So I'm with Porsche from the very early days on, and you see in the middle, you see this is kind of my family roots. There was a few 356s out there, and they were all produced at the coachwork company called Reuter, later became Recaro. You might know this seating company, so it's Reuter Carrosserie Recaro, short version. It's not an Italian company. And this is my family, so I'm connected family-wise with Porsche. And wrote a book about 356 Porsche, and then I was able to join Porsche in early 2018, so when we celebrated the 70th anniversary of the Porsche sport car. 2 weeks ago, on the 8th of June, we celebrated in Zuffenhausen. We brought a little picture of what we did. You might have followed us on the live stream. That was a huge event, and I would like to tell you a little bit what is the 75 years all about, and this anniversary. Why are we celebrating this year? Because the company is older than 75 years. It all started end of the 1930s, and officially was officially opened up in 1931. So the founder of the company is Ferdinand. Yesterday you heard that there are many Ferdinands in the family. The founder of the company is Ferdinand Porsche, and the founder of the brand is Ferry Porsche. So it took a couple of years until 1948 that Ferry Porsche looked around and didn't find the car he was dreaming of, so he decided to build this on his own. This is the famous quote. And on June 8th, the first Porsche 356 Roadster got its general road permission. So this is actually the birthday of the Porsche sports car brand. So we differentiate between Porsche and Porsche sports cars. Okay. You know this, you might know this, this quote. Let me add that you couldn't fulfill your own dream without a perfect team. And this is what Ferry Porsche did, and this is where everything started, in Gmünd in Austria. Porsche moved there in 1944 due to the Second World War and the dangerous situation in Stuttgart, and somewhere there in the Alps they were safe and sound. So they started building up the construction office, and shortly after, in 1948, the first car wearing the Porsche script, and so this is the kind of the birth of the brand. But as you know, the 356 #1 Roadster was a prototype. It was a one-off, and the success of Porsche is based on the car in front of the Roadster, the 356/2 Coupe. In total, including the #1 Roadster, 53 cars were being built in Gmünd before the company moved back to Stuttgart. But so you had to adjust, Ferry Porsche had to adjust his dream, his perfect vision of a sports car a little bit into a 2+2 seater with a rear motor engine, and this is actually the basis for the success of Porsche till today.
Right, okay, now it's my turn. Thank you. So my job in this thing, and we mentioned at the beginning, you talk about this, and I covered the designer. So as a designer, this is like not only my job, but also my passion. The very first, you can't say designer of Porsche because the designer as a job did not exist at that time. I mean, Erwin Komenda, he really made a big mark in the company with a lot of different vehicles throughout Porsche's early history. And he was basically, in German they call it a constructor, but with a good eye and a good talent for nice lines. If you look at some of the early conditions, oh yeah, that's his birthday there, but his birth and death day, but he was, my little cheat sheet here, the Porsche sort of chief designer, if you want to call it that, from 1931, when the company first started building their first cars, up until 1966. So unfortunately, he was already very young. So
he was already part of the team of Ferdinand Porsche, and when Ferry Porsche took over, he was one of the game changers there, or the most important people. And on the left, we see an insight into the Gmünd production. And on the right, this is the first car that was being produced in Stuttgart, not ready yet, but the inspection took place at Reuter in this case, and from there on, the success of Porsche started. And Grant will, on the next slide.
Yeah, I just want to say that picture on the left I really like, because it's like a design studio in like 1947 or something. It just looks like the conditions they had to develop cars in. You talk about that one?
Yeah, that is Erwin Komenda next to Ferry Porsche, and the guy on the left was Karl Rabe, so he was the technical brain behind Porsche, and I assume he was the most important guy at Porsche, not named Porsche. And he was also part of the first team, or actually he was the first employee at Porsche, even before Ferry Porsche, when the construction office opened up in 1931.
So what's really, really cool, I kind of dug around the archives with your help last year, and I came up with this this sort of analogy. It's like, where did the Porsche form language and everything come from? Regardless of who was working for Porsche at that time, the very first cars they did, from the Type 8, it wasn't called the Wanderer, it was the Porsche Type 8 Wanderer, and the 12, these are all in the 32, as well as the 64, which is the Berlin Rome wagon, which everyone knows from 1937-38, a race that never took place. I think everyone knows that story. But when you look at the silhouettes of the cars, there's this ongoing form language that basically carries on up until today. Especially the NSU, the Type 32. I mean, to me it looks like a chopped beetle, but that was also the forerunner Porsche development that preceded the Beetle. And and then if you put these cars together, there's the Beetle, of course. There's some other cars here in the upper left, second from the top, Type 52, which I would love to see in full size. If anyone ever has an idea to, like there's a couple million laying around, I'll help you build that car. But it only existed in drawings. But anyway, you see what's kind of going on here is that this form language, the fastback, even the Studebaker they did in 1952 also had this fastback. So there's this consistency of design, which they took over from 356 and continued all the way up until today. So that's my fun little analogy I made, is that the Porsche form language was established in basically 1931 and has somewhat been just modified, and it's kind of like puts the nail on the head of the way the 911 has been developed throughout the years, with just a very evolutionary and for that reason also very successful.
So Porsche has stayed Porsche, although it's of constant evolution. Let me pick out some people you might know and some people you surely don't know out of the 75 years. This is just a quick overview about some people that were really driven by dreams. In this case, this is Otmar Domnick. He always wanted to be the first customer of Porsche in Germany, and he wrote Ferry Porsche, when you come back to Germany, let me be your first customer. And he fulfilled his dream. Porsche, if you, may I?
Nope, sorry. I was looking for the pointer.
No. If you look at this, we saw the cars just a couple of slides ago. This is the first car being produced in Stuttgart in April 1950. Its nickname is the Windhund, or in English it's Greyhound. And you see the first team at Porsche. For example, let me pick out Herbert Linge here, who recently celebrated his 95th birthday. And it's always a great pleasure talking to him, and he was there from the very beginning. So, coming back to Otmar Domnick, he wanted to be the first customer, and he was successful, he did. And he drove this car with great passion, and he wrote Porsche letters, and he told them, this is good, this isn't good, you could change this, imagine. And Ferry Porsche answered. So you kind of get an impression how the early days started. Porsche never thought that they are going to build and sell more than 500 cars, and this is why the very early cars just have a 4-digit VIN. A year later they found out, okay, we might sell more than 500 cars, so they changed it into a 5-digit number system, and a couple of years later 6 and whatever. So they were they grew with the success. Interesting story about Otmar Domnick. He took this car in 1951 to Morocco and tested a new engine there. And this was a story that came into the first issue of the Christophorus in 1952, and the title was I Was in Africa. So it's only in German because the Christophorus started as a German edition, and then a couple of years later they came up with an English version. But so he was really, really driven by dreams and passionate about this brand new brand. Another guy who was, and I told you, there will be some people you know who was of great importance for Porsche, is Max Hoffmann. Max Hoffmann, born in Austria, and he came to the US in 1933, opened up his store at Park Avenue in New York City, for European brands. And if you imagine, and he met Ferdinand and Ferry Porsche at the Paris Automotive Show in 1950, and in 1950 the first 3 cars were imported to the US, and Ferry Porsche was a little bit skeptical, and he said, oh, I don't know if you sell like 5 cars per, I think it was per year, yeah? And Max Hoffman said, if I don't sell 5 cars per week, I'm not interested. Yeah? So he was one of the early success in racing and export. He was one of the driving factors behind the success of Porsche, the export, and if you imagine that he wanted to import European cars in that time, right after Second World War, and if you think about this, this is kind of an impressive story. Yeah, some pictures of his first venue, outside, inside, with the Speedster. The Speedster is of high influence, or is highly influenced by Max Hoffman. He wanted to have a lighter car. First they built 16 Type 540 Roadster, and then you all know this, the Speedster. I don't know if you know that the very early cars only were available in 3 colors, which was blue, white and red. So the American colors, and I think this is no coincidence. And as I said, this is the basis for the success of Porsche, and if you see what's going on here, it all started somewhere there. And for me, coming over from Zuffenhausen and seeing you all with your Porsches, this is really impressive. It's not all about street cars, so of course racing was a topic from the very early days on. First entrance at the Le Mans 24 Hours was in 1951, but mainly driven by male drivers, but there were a few female drivers, and one was Denise McCluggage. You also should know her, known by her famous helmets. She actually wanted to run, I think, with there should be other brands, but I don't know which one, with the car, and but that wasn't technical all right. So she hopped in a Porsche, and then a year later, in 1957, Huschke von Hahnstein gave her the contract, and they even wanted to enter her at Le Mans, but Le Mans wasn't ready for women, but Porsche was. Yeah, so there were a couple of other ladies that were really successful on Porsche, like Ruth Levy, and in Europe, and this is a lady you might don't know, is Charlize Theron, Gilberte Theron, and she saw the first victory in class in 1951, and she convinced her father to buy her a 356 SL, which is on the right hand side, but there was a picture taken a little bit later. So she raced on 356 SL and 550 Spider. So also women in the early days were driven by Porsche, and for example, Denise McCluggage, she was a journalist, and she wanted to change kind of the side. So first she was a journalist writing about Porsche, and then she was a race driver writing about Porsche. So she changed from the outside view into the inside view, which is also a nice story. Around the same time, this is not the picture of 1956, but the family was highly involved in what was going on. You heard it in the States. Mark told, we heard that Ferry Porsche attended the parade very early, things like that. But Wolfgang Porsche played an important role as within the Porsche family. You see Ferry Porsche with his sons, Ferdinand Alexander, so the father of Mark, who was here yesterday, on the top left, Gerd Porsche, Hans-Peter Porsche, and there in the middle you see Wolfgang Porsche, and on the right hand side you see Wolfgang Porsche with his father at the Le Mans racetrack. At that time he was kind of, I think 13 years old, 13 and a half, and he got the honor on the 16th of March in 1956 to drive, to bring out the 10,000 car. So 6 years after they came back to Germany, to Stuttgart, they were producing, or they produced their 10,000 cars. So if you imagine, at the beginning they never thought that they're going to produce more than 500 cars, and now it's just 6 years later, and they stand there next to their 10,000 cars. This is quite impressive. By the way, last month we produced the 5 millionth Porsche overall. So a really impressive story, and Wolfgang Porsche told me once that he couldn't sleep the night before because he was what's it called? He couldn't sleep because he was was heißt aufgeregt? Excited. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
So,
okay.
Exactly.
Yeah, Grant.
So, my turn again. Yeah, speaking of the Porsche family, we had Ferdinand Alexander Porsche, as otherwise known as Butzi Porsche. I think this is a known story. He started at Porsche in 1957. One of the probably the first designer, as you could say, Porsche that actually studied design, and up until 1972. He became the director of the studio in 1962, and under his stewardship, I guess you could say, I think the A356A was already done, like the B and the C, the 911, of course, and as well as the Targa, the 904 and the 914 were done under him. This next picture, thanks, shows him as a young guy working on a future I wouldn't say the 911, but a successor of the 356. What's interesting on my little part here of talking about the designers, every time there was a design chief change, there was a big turnover. When it went from Komenda to Butzi Porsche, the goal was to look for a successor of the 356, and the same thing later with Lapine, again a successor for the 911, which was the 928, and the same thing with Harm Lagai later, but we'll get into that later. So, what's really cool about this image, this guy keeps showing up here. His name is Hans, a very German name, Hans Springmann, and I actually worked with him when I first started at Porsche, and he was one of the founding members. He was basically a modeler, but here shows a little bit of the team. Obviously, the 356B or C is not yet in existence, and that car in the lower left, that's kind of a mystery to us. We assume that's a VW thing. Nevertheless, I worked very closely with his father. He was working on the 356 and later, of course, with the 911. And moving forward, before a 911 was a 901 or a T7, T8.
T7.
The whole idea of where to bring the company after what happens after the 356 is pretty much, for the most part, rear-engine air-cooled cars. And you can see various influences. I love these old things, how cars were developed. It's sort of like my passion. And then the lower right is, it must have been right around the time, I would say in the late 50s, mid to late 50s, because there's a little bit of an influence of the 718s at the time. The one in the upper, does this pointer work? Ah, there we go. That was a study from an external studio, a designer by the name of Wolfgang von Goertz, who was not only responsible for the BMW 507, and as well as the Datsun 240Z much later, which you can almost kind of see in that study. In any case, it was not a Porsche and was not continued. So eventually, down the road, Porsche, the design studio, is finding its place. And this one it's called the T7.
Yeah, it's the Porsche Type 695.
I don't want to say that. And I think pretty much of this history has been well written. The whole front end of the car is basically how the 911 would eventually look. And still working with the sort of notchback kind of appearance. And the little bit later on down the road, it eventually became the fastback. So this is a really cool old build from a photographer named Julius Weidmann. It's a very staged photo, because we've done that a lot in recent years. Since I've started at Porsche, I always do these staged photos. But one thing is really cool. Here's Hans again. This is Heinz. And these guys are still around, and I'll show you a cool picture of them a little bit later. And on the right here, you can see this is Klee, right? Working closely together with Butzi Porsche on the 904, and Klee was also the designer of the 914.
And in the back, you already could see the 901, and on the next slide you see the 901.
Yeah.
How it came on the market.
Exactly.
So this year we are not only celebrating 75 years of Porsche sports cars, but also 60 years of Porsche 911. By the way, this was one of the reasons why we judged for that early 911, right?
Exactly. Just realizing we have to give gas here a little bit for the other presentation. So one little last thing about this whole team thing, you can see Hans and where's Heinz? Hans and Heinz. So these guys, they're still around, and these guys were doing. I started Porsche in '89. I bought my first 356 in, was it '99? And for $11,500. It's irrelevant. And so I was talking to the modelers there, and I said, "Oh, I bought an old Porsche," and he goes, "Oh, I worked on the facelift of that." And that was Eberhard Brose, which is this guy. And then I got to talking to the other guys, and they worked closely with Tony Hatter doing the 993, but they're also working on 356s even before the B was developed, as well as, of course, the 911, everything else after that. So these guys, I mean, talk about longevity. They're working on all these cars throughout the years, and they're still around. And they're not really that old yet, but they're like super fit in their head. So we had in a separate shop, this is outside of Porsche, but I don't know if you know Alois Ruf. He has the number 6 911 called Quick Blau. And to find out a little bit more of the history of this early prototype, which is a bit oddball, it has some odd parts on it, he pulled these guys from the design studio from way back then who worked on the original 901, back when it had 2 instruments instead of the 5, and pulled them together and just had a little exchange with them. So that's, I always really like that story, that these guys are like around forever.
I guess this is what makes Porsche Porsche, that it's not only the connection to the customers, to the family, but even within the employees. It's of real great pleasure always when we talk with eyewitnesses and listen to their stories.
Yeah. So a little bit more focus on Ferdinand Alexander Porsche. Also Butzi is, he came from the so-called, they call it the Ulmer school back in Germany, and where everything is a little bit more form follows function. That really sort of heavily influenced the brand at the time. I don't like to call it brand, but more like the mark at the time, which made our cars timeless. And the 911, as we know, has basically gone unchanged nearly up until the 996 replaced it. And one of his most favorite projects that he really calls his own, the teamwork that took place in the 911 was one thing, but there was more of a focus on his own personal design of the 904 that was more him. What's interesting about it is when it's kind of hard to see, and this next picture shows how structured the car was. It's much different than a 911. If you put this car, this is like designer talk, sorry. If you put that car in a plan view, you design cars in 3 views. When you look at it, there's a lot of straight lines from the front hood all the way through the door cuts and then to the rear cutout of the rear glass. It's all one straight line. So it's a real structured sort of a, sort of a technical way of designing a car.
And that was in 1963, and let me tell you the story of a guy from 1969. Yes. I don't know if you know him. He was in the NASCAR Apollo 9 mission.
Just a couple of months before Apollo 11 landed on the moon, and when we were working on this book and tried to find stories about people driven by dreams, we also looked at the Christophorus, and there was an article from 1970 or 71, and it said that astronaut is the new dream job for a whole generation, especially in the US. And so he flew to the moon or next to that, and he was, a lot of people, young people looked looked at him, and they dreamed to be an astronaut. And what was his dream? He bought a Porsche. Yeah. So he fulfilled his dream, and he came to Stuttgart and took his 911 Targa with him. On the next slide you see him. So Porsche is the brand for the people who follow their dreams, and this is an early example of that.
So my turn again. I actually had an interview with Tony Lepine when I first was interviewing around, and it was such a strange, he's a real cool character. He's very charming, very unusual, very, it's kind of hard to explain. If everyone ever met Tony Lepine, you would be very impressed of him as a person. He was also the chief designer, succeeding Buzzi Porsche from 1969 to 1988. And he had the job of replacing the 911, of course, which came out to the 928. So a couple of the cars, use my little list here that he was responsible with for, I'll get to this here in a second, is the, I always put on the list here the G model, but he actually influenced the, when he came in 72, 73 RS, with the ducktail spoiler, which we used on a lot of later cars from the exclusive program. The car that's known to be has a ducktail that's 15 millimeters too short, according to Peter Falk. That's another story. So every designer has his background. I was at Audi before I came to Porsche, and Tony Lepine was at GM when his family moved to Nebraska. Originally from Latvia. He wanted to go to Detroit and work for the industry, and somehow got into GM, and he was of course an engineer with a little bit of, almost a little bit Commenda-like, where you have a Sinn for Optik, what do you call that? You have this feeling for design, and eventually established himself working on these Monzas and Corvette stuff with Larry Shinoda back then, but we don't go into too much GM stuff. And then later on, this was taken about 69, right after he started.
Yeah, 70.
And he assembled a team out of the people he met, his favorite people at GM. One is Richard Soderbergh, another American who worked for Porsche back then, good old buddy of mine. And of course on the right side you see Wolfgang Lubius. This car they're working on is the alternative to the 917, which never went into production or was ever built, but still a really cool car. And here's that little team picture, and then going back to, and there's Hans here again. He's you can see he's like everywhere, and just a couple other people here for if anyone's interested. This is Otto Geffert. He helped me a lot later on the Boxster show car. Dorothea Müller-Goodwin had a freaky dress that had this hippie-like stuff going on in 1969, which is, she can't find it. She's still around. And that's the dress that eventually became the hippie graphic on the 917. Yeah, obviously there was a little bit of GM influence when it came time to replace the 911. At that time, what year are we talking about? 69, 70, 71, 72 is when Porsche thought the 911 was at the end of its life. It was only 10 years old, but very wrong, of course. There's a couple of studio images from back then. Not quite yet in the Weissach studio. They moved to Weissach in 72, and which is this image. These are like real images of what it really looks like in the studio. When I started in '89, it looked just like this. In fact, I even sat over there by the window across from 993 designer Tony Hatter.
So let me get back a little, some years before, or at the same time, probably at the same time as Lepine was responsible for the design. Hans Hermann was responsible for the first overall victory at Le Mans, and he was also, that was also a tough challenge. He was with Porsche since 1953. He took part of the Carrera Panamericana, the Mille Miglia, wherever, and then he started for Mercedes-Benz, and then he came back to Porsche because they produced a new car, the 917. And there you see a picture. He doesn't go with a 917 but a 908, and this is from 1969. And Jockey X on the right, he won after 24 hours just by this distance. So it was a really, really close decision. Porsche lost and wasn't successful, and so they even, maybe it's comparable, hopefully it's comparable to this year's Le Mans edition.
I was going to say that, yeah. Wait till next year.
We will talk about this next year, yes. They changed the car a little bit and put Hans Hermann and Richard Edward on the 917 with a short tail, number 23, with that famous design. They weren't the fastest at the beginning, but at the end they were the first. So you always have to remember, yeah, if you would like to finish first, you have to finish first. And this is what Hans Hermann and Richard Edward did. A year later, after they weren't successful, they came back even more successful, and this is also that shows a special ambition, and of course they celebrated this a lot. Yeah, Grant.
Yeah, so the successor of Tony Lapine was the guy that hired me, Harm Lagai. We almost came at the same time. He came a couple months before me and took on a few people from Audi, myself, and a couple others. And the interesting thing about Harm Lagai, or whether it's Tony Lapine or Butzi Porsche, you have their influences and their background and stuff always have an influence on what kind of stuff they do later on in their life. So it's kind of funny because this picture of Harm Lagai here in the middle is a picture when he was just a young guy. Most of what he learned for his career, he learned at Porsche because he did not study to be a designer at that time. So it's like learning by doing, self-made kind of man, stuff like that. And before he became a designer, he was working on all kinds of stuff. This guy had a mega passion for motorsport, and I mean that classic thing of the gasoline in your blood. This is Harm Lagai. He also restored a lot of his race cars and then also drove them, and also had, of course, problems with them, but that's part of it. He also drove Porsches for like Brumos and other companies. The last car he did before he sold it was this for our motorsport, historic motorsport fans, the Shadow by Don Nichols. Really crazy car, very innovative. And with Harm Lagai, what's interesting is he never took the straight path to anything. He always looked for an alternative. And going back a little bit to the past, these are some of the sketches I did for the 924, which of course, I think everyone knows this story. It's called EA425. It was a development program for VW, which Porsche eventually took over. So that was his first job as a young designer at Porsche. And of course, went to BMW after that. And yeah, here's a little bit more focus on some of the 924 stuff. I love these unstaged studio shots like this. And of course, the 924 as it came later. Yeah, that is. And now we're switching to Peter Schutz, but I want to just say something about Harm's list of stuff to do. I mean, when he first came, we were in a terrible, actually a terrible state, and the idea was to basically rebuild the whole model line, stuff like that. So there was, in the previous years, there was three cars, like the 924 and all its derivatives, the 928 and the 911 had nothing to do with each other. So the idea was to do something new. But after that, things really took hold and really expanded the model line. Starting off, of course, anytime a new chief designer comes, the first thing he wants to do is make a big splash. So the first thing he did was he did all the colors, like Ruby Stone or Star?
Ruby Stone.
Ruby Stone. Don't ever say Ruby Star.
No,
Ruby Stone.
At least if I'm around.
And of course the Panamera show car, the 989 studies, which never went anywhere, the Boxster show car, 993, 996, 986, 996, 997, Carrera GT, the Cayenne, and of course the very beginnings of the Panamera. So there's a lot going on in the Lagai time.
And we do have a second chapter showing his work. This time it was under the guidance of Lapine, working working on a new, brand new or totally new design language, starting with the 924, and then the 928 came on the market. Around the same time, in early 1981, Peter W. Schutz, half American, joined Porsche as the CEO, and he had a quite good relationship with Ferry Porsche. As you see, Le Mans is always a thing, and you see Peter W. Schutz on the left and Ferry Porsche looking at him on the right. And yeah, what is, or why did we choose Peter W. Schutz here? He was the guy, or the model range, they decided to not to go on with the 911 anymore, and the 911 should have been cancelled in 1984. So there's that story that there was a memo board in his office, and there were lines how long the cars should be in production, and the 911 ended in 1984. So he took a marker and extended that line over the years, and then he left the memo chart, and he even draw a line on the wall and into the floor, and he was right. So actually he was the guy saving the 911, otherwise we wouldn't be able to celebrate 60 years of 911 today.
So after an extension, a continuation of the the first part of Harm Lagai was the era in the 70s a little bit. I kind of jumped ahead of myself. So when we first started, that was the so-called Wiedeking era. Porsche was not in a good state whatsoever. So one of the first things that we did was, so Harm Lagai, he's a real sports car kind of guy. He ran a BMW Technik, a studio, an external studio where he did the Z1 before he was offered the job as a chief designer at Porsche. And so he comes to Porsche to redo things, and I left Audi at that time to come to Porsche to do sports cars, and the first project we got was a front engine 4-seater 4-door, which kind of like threw me off a little bit, so we worked on that for a little while. But things didn't go so well with that project because it kind of developed itself to death, as they say, because it was basically too costly. And another little cool untold story, there was a parallel sports car with a mid-rear engine V8 based on the 989 called a 996. And that also had all kinds of issues. But in that time, the first 3 years I was at Porsche, things were just going down and down year by year. And in the official reported sales for the fiscal year of 92-93 was 14,362 cars, and they have this thing called, and I just have to mention this, Fremdfertigung, like external contracts, and we sure it's the E500 from Mercedes-Benz because they were sort of helping us out. So the total cars that were built was just a little over 11,000, and the 928, 730 cars, which is a rare model. Meanwhile, if you have a 928 from that era, it must be, there's less of those than there are of some of our special limited editions. So you have to put things in perspective. We made twice as many, sometimes 3 times as many, like Sport Classics or bless you. And it's just, you have to just put things in perspective, kind of just to look back where we were. But things changed. So when we eventually pulled our things together, we came up with this idea of a platform sharing between Boxster and 911. Wasn't that much different from the 989 thing, platform sharing, but it was instead of doing a 4-door, you start low and then you kind of build up from that. So we started with the Boxster 911. We're nearly developed at the same time, but for marketing political reasons and the SLK coming, as SLK from Mercedes and the BMW Z3, we pushed the Boxster to come out a little bit earlier. Yeah, and anyway, so that caused us for the cars to look very similar because there was very, very, very little development money. But eventually, this is like the show car that we built of the successor of the 996 when we were able to finally had some money and we were able to kind of separate the cars a little bit from each other. Yeah. There's our buddy Wendelin.
Wendelin Wiedeking, yes, you were talking about the design and the changes and the difficulties Porsche was in at that time, and the Boxster and then the 996, both of them were the game changers that bring Porsche back on the success track. But it's not only about not only about the design, and this is a good example how everyone has to work together as a team to get through those through this crisis. And Wendelin Wiedeking and his colleagues of the members of the board, like Marchard, for example, and marketing man Dieter Laxi, all of them, they double-check everything within the company. Production-wise, they bring in Japanese guys, telling them how to optimize the production. So it's a combination of rechanging or restructuring all your processes and the whole production process. And then Porsche cut it down just on the 911, and then the Boxster, and a year later the 996 came on the market, and then this was the basis for the success that is going on till today. But you always have to keep in mind that there were worse times, so we have to be thankful that we're not in those worst times.
But things kept going further forward. We were able to, I put these GT1 series because we actually designed those things. I think that goes back to Harm Lagai and his passion for motorsport. He just got his fingers in there with some of the motorsport people. And our design studio actually designed the GT1s from 1996 to 1998. Of course, you need volume. If you want to be successful, at the same time that we decided to get out of Le Mans after the 1998, we announced that we're going to do an SUV. So it confused a lot of people at the time, but it was the best decision ever. I mean, I drive my wife has a Macan, so it's a good thing if you want to. I always go back to this stuff with this Cayenne back then. It's like, well, a lot of our Porsche owners, they never had like one car, one 911, one Boxster, one 928. They always had a Range Rover or another car, or a Mercedes G model. So to keep the Porsche family going, we went into the direction of the SUV. But at the same time, we did a Carrera GT based on the 1999, the V10 from the stillborn, I guess you'd say, 1999 Le Mans effort. So we had this V10 engine laying around. So it's like, okay, we'll get out of Le Mans, but then we'll do an SUV, but wait a second, let's do a supercar too. So that all worked really good. So, your turn.
At the time, the 996 changed Porsche, and Ferry Porsche was able to see what he started when he first looked around and couldn't find the car he was dreaming of. And now in 1996 he was able to see that the 1 millionth Porsche was produced. So if you imagine, you put a stone in the water, and then a couple of years later you see that there were 1 million cars built. That must have been tremendous for him. And as we heard yesterday, the story within the family goes on. Here on the right hand side, this is not Mark Porsche, but Ferdi Porsche. And so, again, here it's a combination of employees, of family, of customers. I think this is what Porsche makes really special.
Right, so moving forward here, we're getting close to the end here. So we didn't pump a lot of stuff here for Michael Maurer, my current boss, or the current chief. He has a much interesting, different background as well. If you look at like Harm Guy with all his motorsport stuff, Michael Maurer coming from Mercedes and then also from GM was more like a strategist. He was very clever as far as like marketing, politics, platform sharing, what fits to Porsche. So a totally different character. He's a very sporty guy, he's vegetarian, he skis a lot, and he's like a good mentor for like good health and things like that, and lightweight people and sports cars. So here's an interesting picture I just decided to throw in there. Peter Reisinger, the guy on the left, was a like the right-hand man of Tony Lapine back then. When they were doing their normal daily work, Peter Reisinger was off in another corner building Tony Lapine's, how do you say, hobby cars. Even though Ferry Porsche knew about that, he just let them do that. So when Tony Lapine retired, Peter Reisinger was still helping Harm the guy with his race car projects. And eventually, when Michael Mauer came in, then Peter Reisinger retired. But I think it's really cool, the picture of the three chief designers all in one picture.
Yeah, and you have to imagine, yeah, there were only 3 chief designers after Ferdinand Alexander Porsche. So with all the changes going on, this is kind of a constant or slow evolution, and also something special within the auto industry, automotive industry.
So it's really funny, when Mauer started at Porsche, here he is describing the form language of the Panamera. That was a tough one, but nevertheless it's very successful. I love Panameras because they, especially GTSs, because they're just an all-around excellent car. But when Mauer first started, he had almost nothing to do. It's kind of a funny thing, because we started the Panamera in the Lagai time, and then when Mauer came, the Panamera was stopped, taking a little bit of a break, and then it started back up again. So that was his first effort. Yeah, and then just another picture of him hanging around at the beach. So it's a thing about Mauer is that everything has to have like a process. You have to describe the design and where it's all coming from, and it worked out great. I mean, the old Lagai days, you'd have a car sitting out in the yard, like a clay model of a new proposal of whatever car, and they would open the doors, and the board of directors just go over to the car. And there was nothing, he didn't say anything about the car. It's like, well, here it is. With Mauer, it just builds up into this big presentation and a very convincing a sort of language to convince the people, the board of directors, that this is what it should be. And it always worked. It also worked for marketing reasons. Like, how did you get there? It was very important for him.
So with Michael Mauer, the design got more like a strategic approach?
Yeah, basically, it was just he gave it a lot of depth, where it's not just, well, here's the car, but sort of like, well, they explain it a little bit. So it worked out really good. So what's also really cool in the Mauer days is that it's extreme high respect from Oliver Blume, our CEO, and for that reason, good budgets for future projects. So the future of Porsche looks bright. We've been able to have millions of euro for like future studies and do things like that, just a couple of sketches of them. And some of you have seen the unseen projects. I mean, there's a book about the unseen. I don't know, 6, 8 cars. Well, there's many more coming, because we're always doing studies. There's a lot of development money for, like we never had before, to look into the future. Did you want to add to that? Or can I go to the next slide?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
So the next view into the future, we were already talking about this yesterday evening. Mr. Mission X presented to the public on the 75th anniversary of Porsche sports cars. There could be no better day to have a look into the future, and this is what the Jubilee this year is all about. It's about the people, and about the customers and people who share our mindset, and about the view into the future. So although we were talking about the history, it's always we were always talking about innovations from the past, so looking forward instead of looking backward. And this is exactly what Oliver Blume does when he took over as a CEO, and for sure his biggest achievement was the Taycan and the whole restructuring in the production in Zuffenhausen. The factory, the Taycan factory, was built up in just 2 years, and while the normal production was still running. So it was like a operation on the open heart, we would say in Germany, yeah. And you see, Zuffenhausen, meanwhile, is really crowded. Yeah? This is somewhere there's like one, you hardly can see it. Here's the museum, and this is the new factory for the Taycan. And if you have a look inside the factory, beside modern production technologies, at the end the cars are made by people with the same passion as the people producing the very first, very early cars in 1948, or when the serial production started in 1950 in Stuttgart. Oliver Blume has also a heart for motorsports, so he's always quite often on the track. And with this we slowly would come to an end with our presentation about the last 75 years. And you see a picture taken 19 times at Le Mans, and you see how employees and how the family, how they celebrate and how they fear and how they work with each other. And here you see again Wolfgang Porsche, and remember the picture I showed you. So
that was a funny picture because they didn't win yet.
Yes.
Yeah, that's why they're like this real
Yes.
critical looks. Their faces changed after they won.
Yes, that's right. But with this picture we would like to go back into the past. You see Wolfgang Porsche there next to Ferry Porsche, and in the middle is Hans Clauser. So Wolfgang Porsche today, he learned from his father, and Ferry Porsche learned from his father. You know? So it's not that you dream all of a sudden and then it's there. You have to be within a family that always has this kind of mindset. And if you have a look here, this is Ferry Porsche, and this is his father, Ferdinand Porsche, at the so-called Sascha race car from 1922. So racing is always in our heart, and learning and finding new ways is always a theme. And at the end, it's not just a marketing claim. By the way, it's our brand core, and this year we took the brand core and used it as the motto for the 75th anniversary. And I hope, or we hope, that you we could give you a short impression why we're all driven by dreams.
Exactly.
And we would like to end up with a short movie there.
Oh, cool.
Some of us chase them. For 75 years, we've been driven by dreams. We dreamt in full color. That's what made us race towards bright ideas. We saw Salzburg red for 24 hours. We made a pink pig fly. And went to green hell and back for victory after victory. Our dreams come in 500,000 shades and counting. Mint green, guards red, speed yellow. We've always been for the bold, the bright and the brave. Even this guy. Our universe is one where dream is a verb. An invitation, a place where artists, racers, and innovators come together. The product of one man's dream. We've been undoing what's always been done. Together, our dream will color the next 75 years. Open your eyes, take the keys. Join us here.
So,
Thank you.
yeah, thanks a lot for your attendance. Have a very good time here at the Porsche Parade. Unfortunately, I got to leave now, flying back to...
I'm sure there are questions. Maybe there's
Yeah,
questions.
if there are questions, of course, yeah.
Or we can do that first. There's one right there already.
Is that first 356
Maybe.
Frank, is that first 356 building in Stuttgart still exists?
No. No, it was crashed a couple of years later, like 3 or 4 years later, because it was used as a test car. The eldest known out of the 4-digit number cars is number 5006, which is recently been restored from our colleagues at the Porsche Museum, Museum Prototype in Hamburg. And this story is, so we didn't talk about this before, but this story is within the book as well, yes.